Hello there, and welcome to episode 15 of Nothing Else Mattress, the music podcast that's set out to try and establish what we think are the 100 greatest albums ever made. To do that, we're using the latest Rolling Stones list from 2020 as a basis, reviewing the 100 on that, voting some in and out, and then when we've got some gaps left, we're going to fill them through nominations from the panel and from our guests and Twitter. We've done 14 episodes so far, 70 reviewed, and I think we've got 45 voted in so far, so about 64%, which tells you we've got 55 left to fill. So got a bit to go yet. Five more to review tonight. Tonight's panel is quality over quantity. We have, first of all, we have John Welsh with us tonight. Hi, John.
Hello, Brian. Good evening.
You good? How you doing, mate? Okay.
Yeah, very well. Thank you.
Good man. Good to see you again. And we love our guests. And tonight we have a guest, and our guest is the founder of the independent not-for-profit record label based in Glasgow. Last Night From Glasgow, and more importantly, Wilco superfan, Ian Smith.
All right.
Good evening, Ian.
Hey, how you doing, Brian?
I'm very good, mate. Thanks again for coming on. Really appreciate
Pleasure.
it.
Pleasure.
Cool. So we've got 5 to go to. Just before we start that, John, I know you didn't make the last one. And I'm not blaming you for not being on, but we actually voted all 5 of the albums on the list, the last one, which is the first time we've
it's
done
the first
that.
time, isn't it? Yeah.
Absolutely. So just as ever, giving you a chance if you want to veto any of those that we voted on.
No.
No, we even voted a jazz album on, which
I know.
is
Yeah.
unusual.
Well,
So
Nothing wrong with that.
not at all, mate, but
absolutely.
we've had some issues with jazz, to be fair. So but we got there. So yeah, really good last time. So we'll see how we do tonight. Cool. So the first one we have on the list at number 30 on the Rolling Stone list is Jimi Hendrix, Are You Experienced? So I'll just give you a quick summary of the Rolling Stones justification. Okay, this is what Britain sounded like in late 66 and early 67. Ablaze with rainbow blues, orchestral guitar feedback and cosmic possibility. Jimi Hendrix's incendiary guitar was historic in itself. The luminescent sum of his Chitlin circuit labours with Little Richard and the Isley Brothers and his melodic exploitation of amp howl. But it was the pictorial heat of songs like Manic Depression and The Wind Cries Mary that established the transcendent promise of psychedelia. Backed by drummer Mitch Mitchell and bassist Noel Redding, the guitarist made soul music for inner space. It's a collection of free feeling and imagination, he said of the album. Imagination is very important. Widely assumed to be about an acid trip, Purple Haze had nothing to do with drugs, Hendrix insisted. It was all about a dream I had that I was walking under the sea. So that was a summary from the Rolling Stone. It was released on 12th of May, 1967. And it was his debut album, obviously. We've had 2 more Hendrix albums on the list so far, Electric Ladyland and Access Bold as Love, which we've voted both on. So this is the 3rd one. Okay, so I guess before we start, John's going to lead us away here, but I guess quick question is, there's a bit of debate about which album we're going to review stroke sign in or off, because the UK version is a bit different to the US version, and the Rolling Stone list is a little bit ambiguous about which one they're reviewing. They call out Purple Haze and stuff there. So what do you want to do? John, you're leading off, mate. So which album are you reviewing?
Well, let's just review both.
Okay, that's fine.
And then we can make a call at the end of it. So
all yours.
I think, yeah, okay. So this is Hendrix's first album, and I think I've read quite a bit over the years about Hendrix, and I really love the story of Hendrix. You know, he starts off and ends up in the army and doesn't really cut it there, and ends up getting discharged. And he becomes a bit of a gun for hire, with various musicians and kind of plodding along. But you look at the list of people he's played with, from Wilson Pickett, Sam Cooke, Jackie Wilson, guys of that caliber, Little Richard, Arthur Lee, absolutely incredible. And then I think, he then moves to London. It's Chas Chandler from the Animals, who's the Animals manager, looked at him and thought, yeah, we can set something up here. So it's quite interesting that he actually had to cross the pond, so to speak, to actually begin to make it in music. And I think, you guys like Andrew Lou Goldman and Seymour Steen had actually knocked him back, had the opportunity to, potentially sign this guy, and didn't think it was worth the chance. So the move to London is quite interesting. I think, obviously this is the first album, and it starts off Foxy Lady. I think, from the UK version. I don't know if that's the first track on the US version, but you still listen to that today, it still sounds incredibly fresh to me, which, really, it stands the times. You get albums that we like, and, you might go and revisit something that's come out for 20, 30 years ago, and you can tell it's really dated, but to me, Foxy Lady, really, it's still got that freshness about it. And I kind of think about it and think, what else was there that sounded like this at the time? And there may well have been, but I'm struggling to think of anything, that was like Hendrix, and I think as well that there's a bit of an aura, probably because he died so young, right? And therefore his career is buttonholed into 3 or 4 years, which is an incredibly short period of time. And you kind of think, well, is the aura greater than the music? But you look at who was following, who was following him at the time. The Beatles were going to watch him live. The Stones were going to watch him live. I think Clapton, all these guys, they were like, who is this? What a talent this guy is. So you look at that and you think, well, that's kind of fair enough. And don't get me wrong, I think there are some duffers, shall we say, on the album. Manic Depression, I think it's a bit wanky, quite frankly. It's overindulgent guitar nonsense at times, and I kind of listen to that, and I think, you fast forward 15 years and you've got all these redneck American bands and heavy metalists, and they're probably looking at that and going, this is the way to go. But he done it with a certain panache, and I think, you've got real blues songs in there like Red House, which I think's, fantastic. I just think it's a really good album. Is it better than, I think we've reviewed another one, haven't we?
Reviewed 3,
Brian?
John. Yeah.
3, have we? Right, okay. I missed one of them on
Axis
one of the
Bold of
calls.
Love and Electric Ladyland.
Yeah.
I think with one of them we wavered a bit. I think Electric Ladyland we put in. I think Axis was a bit of disagreement on, but it went in. But yeah, this was obviously, as you say, his breakthrough one. And it came at that psychedelia point, didn't it, where I suppose timing's everything, that, certainly London appeared to be ready for.
That's right. And I think, just on that point, Third Stone from the Sun, that is psychedelia in a nutshell, really. I think, it's fantastic. It's got distortion in it. It's got, a bit of spoken word, vocal. But the funny thing is, and you mentioned at the start, Purple Haze isn't in there.
Yeah. Or Hey Joe.
Hey Joe, isn't it? The Winter Prize Mary. Yeah, Hey Joe. Yeah, and you can think, so they're on the American version.
Yep.
And I'm, you kind of think, well, does that lessen the UK version? 100% it does, because these are absolute classics. But does the album still stand out? I think it does. I think for, at that point in time, as I say, I'm not sure if there's anybody else doing anything like this. And, he's a bit of a trailblazer. So I'm very much a fan of this.
Okay. So wait, it comes out in May 67, which is sort of fairly relevant because you've touched on some of the connections in the music scene at the time. One of the main ones being the Beatles. So not only are they sort of championing them, but they're also kind of, I guess, at their peak or towards their peak commercially. Because Sgt. Pepper, I think, comes out 2 weeks after his album comes out.
Just on Sgt. Pepper, that came out after, and 2 days after it was released, Hendrix was playing a gig, and he basically did the Sgt. Pepper song on stage, which was, and the Beatles were actually in attendance, and they're just like, what the fuck? This guy's just on a different planet,
I think the story was, he said, if the Beatles won't play live, I'll play their songs, or something to that effect. So cool. Ian, So tell us about Hendrix. First of all, are you a fan?
No,
You're not. Okay,
I'm
that's a
not.
good start.
I mean, in the same way I'm not a fan of Miles Davis or I'm not a fan of John Coltrane. I mean, I can admire it. I can sit there and appreciate the virtuosity of it. But I don't find myself ever really being inclined to listen to it.
Okay.
You know, at a push, I'd sit down and listen to Wing, which is a beautiful song. But to me, it's musicianship over melody. It's performance over song structure. It's everything that I don't go for. You know, my taste in music stems from, you know, classically structured songs and how they hang together. And Hendrix was the complete antithesis of this. No doubt seeing him live would have been an incredible experience. And I imagine that those people who were championing him and he was, you know, a huge inspiration to, it would have been that performatory element of it. But I've got to struggle. I mean, I struggle with so much of this Rolling Stones list. About 90% of it, I think. But
Yeah.
things like suggesting that this album is more important than the 70 that came before it, I wouldn't have it being more important than Electric Ladyland, which is, I think, is a more complete finish. So don't get me wrong, I'm not disrespectful of him. I'm not somebody who thinks we should sully his name. But in the 2,500, 3,000 vinyl records I possess no Jimi Hendrix records.
Okay, that's interesting.
I'll tell you what I think of Hendrix.
We've had this chat before where, you know, we've probably been quite respectful of the impact that an album's had. But then we've to chat about have you actually owned a copy at any point. And then I think, do you remember Loveless? I think, John, My Bloody Valentine, we
Yes.
chatted about that.
Yeah, I think it was the only one that voted for that, wasn't there?
Well, we all liked it.
That.
Well, we all liked it, but most of us never owned a coffee, so it was that kind of the same thing again about.
I don't think everybody liked it. I think there was some absolute shredding going on by Mr. Patterson.
Yeah, but he can't defend himself tonight. Okay, so I think it's a fair point. I think he definitely had a sort of time is everything, isn't it? So I suppose he had his moment in the sun, literally in '67. Psychedelia's landed, Beatles are backing him. And he couldn't kick a ball, he couldn't cross the road in America, you know. So I suppose it was kind of shut or bust really in London. Interestingly, I think after he released this album, he goes back to America, doesn't he? And for a bit, so he's still touring with the Monkees in America, which I guess would be quite an interesting night to kind of tap into. So he moves on quite quickly, and I guess it kind of becomes commercially quite successful. The album doesn't get to number one in the UK, but it's number two, which fair effort for him, really, considering where he came from. And the Beatles kept him off because they were number one for Yonks with Sgt. Pepper's. So, so it's kind of done well all around, really. And I guess it's just really whether we think, you know, on balance, the songs plus what he is and what he stands for is more important than whether the actual, you know, the kind of history, if you want, is positive enough. So the guys who aren't on tonight were all, you'll be pleased to know, Ian, were all yeses.
Really?
Yeah, they were. Chris Thompson, George, Dixon Telfer, Skin, and Martin Metcalf all voted this one as a yes. So and we do give them a vote if they've got the time to vote in. So so on that basis, then we can kind of add to that. The only other thing I was going to mention was, you know, I think that the way the albums are played out, there are some sort of really nice kind of references in there. Because I know that, for example, MC5 are sort of fairly big influence on a couple of the songs for him. So, albeit he was a bit kind of, you're right, a bit, I don't know, heavy rocky, Ian, you know, a bit kind of all over the place. But some of what he was learning from and leaning into was fairly relevant at the time. So,
I don't doubt these things are relevant, but I think whenever you're going to compile a list, that list is open to objective and subjective review. And I'll say more of this when I come on to the next album. But I can think of 500 records better than this, which means this can't be in the top 100.
Okay, well, that's why you're on, mate. So So I said the other guys are pretty much carrying it. I think Ian, you sound like a
Can't
mate.
trust Skinner. He's deaf. He knows nothing about music.
I'll let Graham come back to you on that one. So I'm putting you
He
down as a
hears
maybe.
me.
I'm putting you down as a maybe, Ian, for that. Yeah.
I think it probably deserves its place in the top 500 albums. I don't think it's a top 100 album.
Okay. No bother. John.
Yeah, I think it does deserve its place. I think it's a bit of a game changer when it came out. So for that reason and what I've already stated, I'm voting it in.
Okay,
just to mention, you just mentioned the Monkees there.
Yeah.
Just to go off on a bit of a sidetrack, Mickey DeLenz is releasing an EP in a few weeks' time of REM songs, REM covers. He's doing.
Okay.
So look out for that.
Ian, you'll be all over that, mate.
Man to God.
Man
I love
to
it.
God.
Now, give me every Monkees album in the top 100 without a heartbeat.
Well, there's an interesting chat because they've got nothing on the list yet. So
Yeah, that's scandalous.
We've got opportunities to fill some of those as we get down the line. I would actually put this one on, and I genuinely am a particularly big Hendrix fan. I think I voted against the other two, but I do think this one has a real relevance to what was going on, and I guess some of what happened. I don't particularly like a lot of what happened after that kind of heavy blues stuff, but I guess it did create a whole kind of joint run stuff. So
I'm not going to object too much.
Thank you, Ian. Thank you. We'll be here all night, mate. Twitter, what would we say? Twitter a bit of fans, 85%, yes. George has always got an issue with our Twitter friends, but they've carried it as well. Okay, so Hendrix is in, which is good. Next one is that lesser known band from Liverpool called the Beatles, with the Beatles / the White Album. So Rolling Stone said they wrote the songs while on retreat with the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi in India, taking a break from the celebrity grind. As John Lennon later said, we sat in the mountains eating lousy veg food and we wrote all these great songs. They came back with more great tunes than they could release. Lennon pursued his hard-edged vision in the cynical wit of Sexy Sadie and Happiness is a Warm Gun, as well as the childlike yearning of Julia and Dear Prudence. Paul McCartney's playful pop energy came through in Martha My Dear and his inversion of Chuck Berry's American Values back in the USSR. Harrison's spiritual yearning led him to Long, Long, Long and While My Guitar Gently Weeps, featuring a guest guitar solo from Eric Clapton. Even Ringo Starr contributes his first original, The Country Tinge Don't Pass Me By. The Beatles tried a little of everything and all their adventures paid off, according to Rolling Stone. So that's the Beatles / White Album. Was number 29 on the list, released 22nd of November 68, and it's the second one we've reviewed. We reviewed Rubber Soul, I think, on the last episode and voted it in. Mr. Smith, take us away.
Okay, so let's just start with the simple statement of fact that if we are going to assess the greatest albums in contemporary music history, and Beatles aren't sitting 1, 2, 3, and 4 in that list, the person compiling the list is a fucking idiot. Okay? I'm willing to concede that Pet Sounds by the Beach Boys is a good shout for 5. And then we can start discussing the rest of the Beatles, along with Dylan, Joni Mitchell, Van Morrison, and anything post 1980 can take.
Sorry, what? Van Morrison?
Absolutely.
Get this guy off of here, Brian.
Absolutely.
Van Morrison.
Masterpiece.
I think you said Rush there, John, as well.
Yeah, I did. I fucking didn't say Rush.
Right, okay. Fucking Rush and Van Morrison. I'm done.
But in all seriousness, it's laughable to me that the Beatles' White Album is sitting anywhere other than top 3 records ever recorded by anyone ever. It's not the best Beatles album. That's Abbey Road, which Rolling Stone have got in the right position for Beatles albums, but the wrong position for albums. But it's anyone listening to it has got to see the depth of craft, depth of ability, melody, intelligence, imagination. It's from start to finish a mesmerizing work. Contains some of the most beautiful songs ever written. I think Julia, Blackbird, heartbreaking ballads of the objections, and a lot of people who are not Beatles fans slag off McCartney and throw up what they consider to be throwaway songs. I reckon I could spend an hour talking about why Rocky Raccoon is a masterpiece. And I think if Noel Coward had written that, or Hoagie Carmichael had written that for a musical, people would be extolling the virtues of the brilliance of the melody and the brilliance of the lyric. I don't know what else needs to be said about it. It opens me back in the USSR. If you can think of a better opening track to an album, I'll doff my cap. It's a band at the peak of their powers, not being afraid to be creative. I would say it's a much greater success in the album I'll compare it to, but I could call it the Beatles Sandinista, because they don't do anything, but they let everything in. The closing kind of revolution, 11 minutes at the end, which is a struggle to replicate that since. Yeah, I mean, I think it's a start to finish Stonewall masterpiece, and the 28 records above it in the list, only 2 of them are correct, and they're the other 2 Beatles albums above it.
We should have got you on. We should have got you on 70 albums ago, Ian. It'd have been a lot easier, wouldn't it?
Well, I mean, I was saying this earlier to Julia. I was talking to Julia. The list is to create diversity. But if you were to say to me, tell me the 20 best episodes of television ever, I would say the first 20 episodes of The Wire. And then we'll talk about something else. Because demonstrably, every one of those is better than the best of something else. And I would say the same is true of the Beatles. If you can listen to the White Album next to the Wu-Tang Clan and tell me the Wu-Tang Clan album's better, then God, good on you, because it isn't.
Okay, so I'm a self-confessed Beatles fan, right? I love the Beatles, right? However, in the spirit of challenging to make sure we sign things on or off through healthy debate. So this is a 30-track album, 92 minutes long.
Yep.
And it is different, of course, because of that, and it's a double album, and that was unusual pretty much at the time, and you know, all the light and shade and all the things that you talk about. But there is a counterpoint that suggests that there's sort of the padding, if you want. There's too much diversity. That it could have done with shaving. You know, a 16-track single album would have been the Abbey Road 2, or you know, whatever you want to call that. So do you not buy into any of that at all?
No, because Abbey Road is already the shaving of the White Album. If you've heard the Escher demos, they'd already most of Abbey Road during the White Album sessions. The Polythene Palm, Mean Mr. Mustard, she came in through the bathroom window. The brilliance of the White Album is it's the one album where you actually get to hear them say, to hell with it, we're doing everything. And if you've sat and watched Get Back, the people who don't like the Beatles say, Christ, it's 15 hours of watching the Beatles. And you're like, yeah, could you make it 30 hours, please? I can watch this for the rest of my life. So there's an element of hearing the true brilliance in everything they do. And I don't think people, I'm not suggesting this to anyone we're talking to just now, but people listen to Beatles songs and they hear simplicity, they hear obvious melody, and what they absolutely do not understand is that McCartney in particular was such an obsessive studier of chords and of recording that they would spend hours searching for the perfect melody that would create the simplicity that makes it sound like they just threw it out in 2 minutes.
Yeah.
That's a genius that no one else in the world of music has ever had. I hold McCartney to be singly the most important composer the world's ever seen. You can take every classical composer and have them stand behind McCartney, and every great jazz composer can stand behind them, because none of them can do what he can do, which is turn the most complex and difficult job into the world and turn. And I think the White Album is a great, and it's not just McCartney, because Lennon's at it and Harrison's throwing in classics, and even as you say, Starr comes up with an actual song for it. But it's an opportunity to hear the noodling. And what's beautiful about that is to go, so that was a throwaway Beatles song. So what would you drop off it? You might drop Piggies off it. Yeah, I'm willing to accept that. There's not a McCartney song I dropped from it. I think they're all standouts.
Wild Honey Pie?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. And would you, and my last question then, would you add Hey Jude?
Eh,
It was recorded pretty much at the same time, released slightly just before the album.
yeah, but that's true of so many of this stuff. I mean, look at all the singles they released that were never on albums.
Sure.
So many Beatles songs that you're like, oh, that'll be on. No, it's not on. Or that should be in Revolver. It's not on Revolver. That should be on Help. That should be in Rubber Soul. So
Yeah,
I wouldn't change a thing.
But if you're in for a penny, if it's 30 tracks, you might as well have 31, right?
Oh, Christ. I think the
I think
Escher
there's
should form part of the whole album. I'll take the quadruple super deluxe reboot. I mean, and I'll listen to that whilst you're talking about albums 27 and 28 and 26 because they're wrong. They're not better than the White Album.
Yeah, well, you know, the public jumped on that, didn't they? I think for a double album, it sold massively. And some of that's because of the Beatles, but you know, I can imagine price points and stuff would have been fairly high at the time for buying a double album, and it still was, you know, 24 times platinum over the 60s and 70s. So, yeah,
it's a beautiful artifact. If we're talking about records, I mean, I was going to get up and grab my mono copy or my box set copy or my stereo copy, but the mono copy top opens. So it's a double album and the records come out the top, which is really beautiful. It came with 4 prints, a poster. I mean, everything about it was just, oh, this is a thing.
Okay.
It's great.
Just before John comes in, the critics at the time preferred Beggar's Banquet to the White
Album. They did. Yeah, they're wrong.
Just interesting, because obviously Stones had always generally been in the shadow of the Beatles per se, you know, albeit they were doing very well for themselves.
Yeah, I think that's in every. But at every generational point, there will be a critical argument about the merits of a band, and then time will pass and people will reflect upon it. I'm not wishing to get sidetracked into a kind of debate about Britpop, but 30 years ago, people were arguing who was better, Blur or Oasis, and I think it's been convincingly proven in the last 20 years that Albarn was 10 times the songwriter Noel Gallagher ever was. But at the time, it seemed that Gallagher had the golden ticket. And I'm sure when Beggar's Banquet came out, which I don't think is as good an album as Let It Bleed, but it's still great, and it's not as good as album as Sticky Fingers or Exile on Main Street, but it's the start of that kind of really golden period of the Square and Mystery Tour, Peppers, White Album, or the Opus Abbey Road, which is just a sensation.
Okay, and I could argue Jarvis Copper usurps Albarn and Gallagher.
I'd have that argument with you, and I would die on the Albarn hill. I think the new album wins it hands down.
John, come in and help me, mate. So I think Ian appears to be supportive of the nomination. So
oh no, it definitely should be there. It's a piece of shit.
It's Jarvis's birthday today, isn't it?
60, yeah.
60 today, yeah. And Damon and I are cousins.
Go on then.
Well, not really, but he did sign me into King Tut's for one of their first gigs in Scotland that was sold out when they'd released the She's So High single. And I went up thinking, well, nobody knows this band. I'll get in no problem. It was sold out, but Damon said, I'll get you in, you're my Scottish cousin. And came back and signed me in the guest list, which was
very good.
Fantastic. So there we go. Anyway, coming back to the Beatles, and I agree mainly with what Ian's saying. He talked about simplicity, and funnily enough, when I was writing a couple of notes about this. There's so many songs, and that's what I've written next to them, simplicity. But simplicity is a fucking hard thing to pull off. You know, songs like I Will, Julia, but Ian's right, you know, to find that point and get it right is, you know, there's no many can pull that off. So I think, you know, it's a double album, right? And you'll know, Brian, I often talk about this on this particular call, that, you know, I always look at how long the album lasts, and that you know, there's a certain window for me for an album length, you know, and it's generally that sort of 40 to 50 minutes. This is kind of double that, right? But it's a double album. But that's okay as long as you can as long as it stacks up, and this one does. I think there are some duffers on there, you know, and I'll probably annoy Ian here slightly, but you know, I'm not a fan of, you know, you mentioned Piggies. I'm not a fan of that. Rocky Raccoon doesn't do it for me.
I love Rocky Raccoon.
I'm not a fan of Blackbird, right? So they don't do it for me. But the point with this album is there's always something coming up that gets your interest, that ticks the box. So, you know, for a couple of minutes, 2 or 3 minutes, yeah, it's not a song I really get or I like, but I know something better's coming along, and you know, the next song or the song after, and that, you know, you get 30 songs in there, and you know, most double albums these days, you're probably talking 15, 16 songs at times. You know, four songs, 4 or 5 songs maybe on each side. This is 30 songs. That's a hell of a lot to pull off. So I think there's a lot going on. There's a bit of indulgence. What's quite interesting as well, that, you know, of those 30 songs, only the 4 Beatles only appear together in 16 of them, which is just over half. You know, I thought it was quite interesting. I think the dynamic as well, was a lot going on with that album. I think, you know, it's possibly the beginning of the band imploding as well. So, you know, there's a lot of fractious relationships going on, and like say, you know, I think Yoko Ono been there quite a lot as well, which hadn't really happened before. So he pissed people off, Ringo leaving for a period of time, all of that kind of stuff. By the way, see Ringo's song in it, the kind of country and western one, I love that. I think that is a fantastic song.
It's the band's favourite song on the album.
Is it really?
It is.
Really?
Yeah.
Didn't know that. You know, you mentioned even like say Honey Pie, you know, you've got that kind of vaudeville-esque music hall kind of theme. Love that as well. So there's quite a bit of variety on. I think too much going on. I don't buy into that. I like bands that will, you know, they don't stick to the same theme album after album. That's boring. You know, go and do something different, you know, and you know, not one band that kind of springs to mind. I'm clearly not putting them in the same category as the Beatles, but the Jam did that. You know, they changed a little bit. You know, not necessarily for the album, but as they went through, well, of getting to, you know, purely different things. You get the 4 Beatles here. You know, they've went to India. They're, you know, getting different influences, and you know, they're looking for, right, what else can I do as a musician? What else can I get into? Where are my influences coming from? And that really comes out and shines in this album for me. And it is markedly different from Sgt. Pepper as well, which I think that came out the year before, hadn't it?
Yeah, about
67,
about 18 months, yeah. And you get the Magical Mystery Tour kind of in between.
Yeah. Well, in between, yeah. So I think, you know, they've really moved in a different way. There's lots of styles going on here.
There's something at play when you go.
No, I just really love it. Is what I was going to say. So yeah, when you go in,
I was just going to say that if we're talking about, I mean, there's 2 things I would pick up on. We're talking about the Hendrix album and the significance of it as a work, and I struggle to think of a more resonant song than Blackbird as a stereotypical anthem for the times that America was going through at that point. Christ, Blackbird's it. What a incredibly moving, touching epitaph to all the troubles. But that's not really where I was going to go with this. My real point is, I don't think it's a band expanding and trying things. It's a band rudderless because Epstein's dead.
That's right.
And that's everything about the Beatles had been managed, controlled. We were sitting today discussing in the pub, not in the pub, just discussing as we often do, the kind of process of bands and how they function, and the incapacity often for bands to trust someone to lead their career. And Epstein had been there for the Beatles from the get-go, and when Epstein died, McCartney lost his mentor, Lennon lost somebody he trusted. Harrison and Starr both lost somebody they looked up to. And what you see, I think, is in the Beatles is everyone jockeying for position in the White Album. And then by the time Abbey Road comes along and Let It Be comes along, McCartney's gone, well, I'm driving this bus. Probably rightly so. But to me, it might come across almost as a self-indulgent, let's try this. I think actually what it is no one's told us no. There's no one sitting there going, oh, that's pish, get rid of that, don't do that, go record a simple album. And also, you know, Lennon's discovered heroin. He's buggering off to get high out his tits all the time. So he's leaving the band to fragment. And this great suggestion that McCartney was the person that broke up the Beatles, he was the one clinging to life trying to keep the band together.
Yeah.
So I find it quite a sad album. And I think it's an inspiring record, and it's clearly a band on the collapse. And then Abbey Road's the big shit, let's pull it back together and try and fix it all one more time. So it's just part of that incredible journey. And coming in the back, a Mystery Tour and Sgt. Pepper's, which were so cohesive, and then Rubber Soul and Revolver that were so cohesive as units. It's quite bizarre. It feels something so free-flowing and almost jazz-like in its structure because there's no rules to it.
Yeah, I'd agree with all that. I don't want to add to your chat. So I think it's an amazing album. Played Devil's Advocate on the length of it and one or two fillers. I might still take you on in the odd McCartney song, but I do think it's an amazing record. I did, talking about could you have added more songs on, I did read that they did 102 takes of Not Guilty, you know, the Harrison track, and then chose not to put it on, which again is probably a good call. I think it came out later on, didn't it, one of his solo records. But you know, you're right, there were so many songs that they've probably put the vast majority of them on, but I'm sure, as you say, there's some of the stuff that went on to Abbey Road and Let It Be was kind of kicking about at that point as well. Well, a couple of things to mention, and then we'll just hopefully tick it and move on. You know, massive seller, of course, don't need to really talk about that. Sold 3.3 million in the US in its first week, which I thought was a bit amazing. We did a little Twitter poll just last week or 2 weeks ago, because I think there's 4 double albums, I think, in the top 30 of the list at the moment. And we did a chat to say, out of the 4 doubles, what do you make to be the best double? And I actually thought this would have been the best double, but it wasn't. So London Calling got voted slightly ahead of it, albeit it was pretty.
Splash album.
That's just what the poll said, Ian. I'm just feeding it back, mate. So it was London Calling, it was Exile, and it was Songs of Key Life. And
you see that?
I can see that. Yeah, I got that, mate.
See my corner. There you go. It's over there somewhere.
That looks like the Geddy Lee there, is it, John? Is that the Rush guy?
No.
Yeah, so absolutely, you know, it's an amazing record. They are beyond probably beyond categorization, really. Kind of just about everything we've listened to since then's got its basis around the Beatles, and we'll no doubt revisit them again over the next few episodes. One other PS to it was, of course, which is one of my favourite songs on the record, Obladi Oblada. Was, get this right now, was it the first record that a Scottish band had a UK number 1 with?
That's right.
Marmalade.
Yeah.
So, which I always love it for that.
It's also that song reminds me of my childhood. My mum used to sing it to me in the kitchen when I was about 3. I always remember dancing away with my mum, that song. Yeah. So that song's got a special place for me.
Yeah. We don't have any Beatles solo albums in the 100 at the moment, Ian.
Yeah, well, that's nonsensical.
I'm just saying, mate. There was one on the list, which was Lennon's first solo album.
Yeah, McCartney Ram's a masterpiece. Ram should be in everybody's top 20. Well,
we voted the Lennon one off, so just saying. I think we'll blame George and the guys for that one as well, John, right? Since they're not on.
I'm not going to try and I am perfectly sated with my knowledge of this, you know. I don't need Rolling Stones and a bunch of 23-year-olds Americans tell me what the best albums are.
Yeah, I know, mate. I know. Last point was...
This is why you're on those, so we can influence...
We can influence the future.
What this top 100 is. Yeah.
Of course we can, yeah. Someone did say to me, I didn't really get this, but I sort of looked at it a bit. They said they thought Birthday was like the start of glam rock. Do you get that at all? You know, the kind of the over
No.
the top, the shalalas, the sing-alongs, the you know, the sort of foot stomping element of it. It kind of usurped rock and roll into something different.
Well, I think there's loads of songs in that album that do that. I mean, they say, you know, Helter Skelter's the start of metal.
Get blisters on his fingers, right? So, cool. So I think we are at another clean sweep again. All the guys that come in, including Graham, were yeses on the White Album.
Clearly, there's hearing aids in when you listen to that one.
Absolutely. He's redeemed himself. I guess we're all in, are we, John, Ian?
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yeah, me too, mate. It's a cracking record. I think that's the last week clean sweep we get tonight. I think the rest might be a wee bit more interesting. Cool. Okay, so the next one we have is D'Angelo with Voodoo at number 28. Okay, so summary of that is, in the 5 years following the release of his 1995 debut, Brown Sugar, D'Angelo grew disillusioned with the genre that had him anointed as a rising star. I don't consider myself an R&B artist, the then 26-year-old told the magazine. R&B is pop, that's a new word for R&B. In his quest to create something new, he looked to both the masters of soul, Marvin, Curtis, Stevie, etc., and contemporary innovators, Lauryn Hill, Erykah Badu, etc. The end result was Voodoo, a moving, inventive masterpiece that stands as the ultimate achievement of the neo-soul era. Crafted with producer and drummer Questlove, who called the LP a vicarious fantasy, Voodoo places Pink Floyd-style cosmic jams next to Prince-inspired erotica. I'm just looking at Voodoo as the beginning, D'Angelo said at the time. It took a while, but I'm on my way now. So that was 28, D'Angelo Voodoo, released on the 25th of January 2000, and it's his only album on the list. John, Voodoo, D'Angelo, what do you think, mate?
Yeah, so I'd never heard of this guy. Hands up, never heard of him in my life before, so I had no idea what to expect. I did expect some sort of hip hop album, so I was completely wrong there. But again, and I'll mention it, and I know I sound like, you know, broken record here. 80 minutes long, too long, far too long, right? So it's a neo soul album, which again is a new genre for me. So I'm glad I'm on this trip to a point. I'm learning new artists. I'm learning new genres.
We voted in Frank Ocean.
Yeah,
about 50 albums ago, I think.
It's released in the decade that was the barren desert for great albums, the 90s. So looked into this guy, and you can think a lot of collaborating, Erykah Badu, Lauryn Hill, Grammy Awards, all that kind of stuff. So good. Listen to it. I get a lot of Prince in here, bit of Q-Tip, and interestingly, I think Q-Tip was asked to record in one of the songs, and they did, but they didn't like it, so it got pulled. So actually, as I started listening to it, Devil's Pie, which I think is the second song, Left and Right, that follows it, which includes Method Man, who we'll talk about in a little while as well. I really liked those songs. Really felt, you know, pretty good. I thought, yeah, I'm liking this album. Textured, a bit layered, a little bit of hip hop, R&B, very Prince. But also maybe looking back to, you know, I think he's got a lot of influences from, you know, back in the day, the Marvin Gaye's of the world and all that kind of stuff. But I just felt after a while it just sounded quite samey. It wasn't standing out, and I thought it started off really, really well, but it just meandered eventually to me, and I just got bored with it. But I thought, no, give it another listen, and I did, and I gave it a third listen. And I guess you know, if you've done economics, my economies of scale were getting less and less with every listen on this, right? I can appreciate it, but it got a bit grating, so not for me. But I think I looked into him as a person. I think he's quite a complex character there as well. You know, and kind of reading about him was kind of quite interesting as well in many ways. And I talk about the Prince aspect, and there's a song in there, Chicken Grease, which I think Prince used as a kind of technical term for a guitar chord. So he, kind of picked up on that. But I think, I'm not saying he's a Prince wannabe, but I just, it didn't do enough for me to warrant, to say this is a top 100 album. And I think you look at these lists, right? I think, this is really, to me, I'm surprised it's so high up on the list. And I bet if they do this now or in 5 years' time, I'd be surprised if this is top 100.
Okay, so it was released right at the back end of the decade. It was his second studio album. It was huge at the time, and sort of surprisingly huge. It was straight into the US #1, sold 320,000 copies in the first week, 33 weeks in the chart, became an overnight star, etc., etc. But the interesting thing was he didn't then do another album for thick end of 15 years. So, and there's a whole bunch of reasons for that, but he wasn't a Jay-Z guy who then jumped in and started knocking an album out every other year. So there is a bit of complexity there. Like you, John, I'm a huge Prince fan, and I love that kind of ballady Prince, the kind of soul thing that he does and whatever. But I only love it within the diversity of what Prince does. I couldn't listen to it all the time, and I felt similar to you, mate. Ian, what are you thinking, mate?
I thought it was shite. I mean, I could.
Hold on. You knew D'Angelo, or you listened to it for the first time?
I've listened to a lot of this, and I think, I'll take, for example, I would stand up and say I think the Lauryn Hill Miseducation is a sensation. Or else my dog decided to run in the door. If you hear a pitter patter of a spaniel, apologies.
Can I have a vote, Bennett?
I think Lauryn Hill's album's a master, and I think Erykah Badu's Baduism album's a tremendous record.
Yeah,
both of them are sensational because they are dealing with universal subject matter, and the quality of the songs trumps everything else about it. This, to me, is a product of very much style over substance. It's not for me. I think it's for people 30 years younger than me. I don't think he would expect me to like it. But again, I'm looking at this list, and sorry, I'm a broken record, but I'm thinking you're bringing out a modern day soul album that you're going to suggest is greater than Al Green's finest work, greater than Curtis Mayfield's finest work, but more damning. You think's a better album than Sign of the Times?
Agreed.
Times is 22 places lower than this in the chart. Sign of the Times is a universal album of, spirituality, love, failure, regret, depression. It's an opus. It would stand up against most modern albums and leaves this D'Angelo record standing. But for some reason, a pocket of people champion it. And I don't think they're championing the quality of the music. I think they're championing what it stands for, or what it. And I think some seems true of Jimi Hendrix. It's about a record which did something, rather than a record that stands up. I totally agree. You would take this poll once, but then we're not going to find some of the records that are scuffing about the top 10 are going to be there either, because they've had their time in the sun. This is not a record we're going to look back on the way you might look back on Curtis Mayfield's debut album and think, wow, that's a beauty. So no, I'm with you. It's tedious. It's like watching paint dry. It's got interesting layers and textures, and it feels quite, it's very well produced and it's very well thought out, but I couldn't give a flying fuck about any of it.
Perfect.
Sorry.
That's perfect. That's what you're on for, mate.
Yep.
I think the intro. I maybe wouldn't use the same summary, but I would pretty much concur with all of what you've said. And John, the interesting thing for me is that he appears to put so much credence into the fact that he was using all the soul greats as his kind of, he called it his Yoda, that he had it all on. He was watching Soul Train episodes on repeat while he was, recording it and stuff like that. But I don't feel any of that coming through at all. It just feels like a
But
studio.
it's got none of the sass of Al Green. It's got none of the passion of Marvin Gaye, and it's got none of the proper edge of Curtis Mayfield. It's just not there. It feels like it's been. I mean, I reckon if you got a chatbot robot to write an R&B album, they'd write.
Yeah, I get that. And interestingly, of course, it was recorded at Electric Lady Studios.
Yeah.
So back to the only person who didn't record there was Hendrix. So,
I think it's, it does reference, Al Green, Marvin Gaye, James Brown, Sly and the Family Stone, Hendrix as well, right? And they talk about the way it's been recorded and stuff like that, but that's all great. But you've got to have the tunes. You've got to have the tune. It's like saying, I've got this influence, that influence, but you've got to deliver on it. And this does not deliver to the point that, you are saying, these are greats and I want to be a great. I think it's a bit style over substance for me.
It reminded me, and I don't know how I got to this point, but it reminded me of listening to Toto.
I would
Africa.
Listen to Toto. Right.
I think you get my point, Ian, right? That Toto were very popular, weren't they? And that's fine if people like Toto, but every time I ever heard them on Steve Wright in the afternoon or whatever it was, I just zoned out all the time. I was like, I can't even stay with it for a song, never mind an album. So it reminds me quite a lot of that. I think we'll call it, and the guys were all the opposite of the other two that. They either didn't know the album. A couple of guys were quite honest to say don't know it, which probably tells you something in itself, or the guys that knew it didn't like it, with the exception of Josh Patterson, who voted it in as
what does he know?
Well, what I was going to say, George he'll have right of reply at some point, mate. But what I was going to say, George takes umbrage at the Twitter polls that we do when they don't agree with what George thinks, and on this poll, 93%. Said this wasn't one of the greatest albums, which means only 7% agree with the great man. So we'll see what he makes of that one. Can I just make a PS to this before we vote it no and move it on? I guess there's probably a talented guy in here. And interestingly, I did pick up on YouTube that when Prince died, I think it was 2 or 3 days after that, he went on the Jimmy Fallon show and played Sometimes It Snows in April, just on the piano. And it's fantastic.
That's because that's a good song.
I get that. I get that, but he could have stuck a big band behind it and done the same stuff, and he didn't. And he sings it. I think there's
Ed Sheeran on the Jimmy Fallon show with a piano doing Sometimes It Snows in April, and it'd be brilliant because it's a brilliant song.
No, I'm drawing a line on that, mate. Come on, right? So we're moving on. So I don't think D'Angelo cuts the mustard, as they say with us. One up from that.
I will disappear from screen for a second and be back in 2 secs.
No problem.
Keep a monkey, mate.
No problem. I'll just do a review for 27 while we're there, and Ian's going to lead the review as well. So 27 on the list is the Wu-Tang Clan, Enter the Wu-Tang brackets 36 Chambers, close brackets. Okay, so I had some fun with this one. So the first Wu-Tang Clan album launched rap's most dominant franchise by inventing a new sound built around a hectic panoply of voices and spare raw beats. RZA, the group's sonic mastermind, constructed the Wu's homemade world, he said, from a mix of Eastern philosophy picked up from Kung Fu movies, watered down Nation of Islam preaching, picked up on the New York streets, and comic books. On Cream, Protect Your Neck, and the non-metaphorical Wu-Tang Clan Ain't Nothing to Fuck With, RZA's offbeat samples, fellow New York Barbra Streisand, Thelonious Monk and the Dramatics, create a grounding for the group's 9 members. And Dr. Dre and Snoop Dogg had established LA as a centre of hip-hop innovation and daring, but the Wu reclaimed the crown for the music's birthplace. I was just reading the summary from Rolling Stone there, Ian, I'll let you come in. It was released on 9th of November 1993. It was their debut album at the time. Ian, you're leading us on this one. I'm looking forward to this.
Takes deep breath. So I really don't like this record. I really don't like the Wu-Tang Clan. I really dislike huge sections of the hip hop scene. I can't abide, and I'm sorry, the W in Wu-Tang's meant to stand fucking misogyny. And this album is full of it. It's full of violent references. It's full of everything that makes my stomach churn the way watching Russell Brand's comedy always made my stomach churn. I'm going to sound like somebody who doesn't have a love for hip hop, and that's not true. I would say that singly the greatest live performance I've ever seen in my life was Public Enemy at Reading in '92. And I think Chuck D and Flavor Flav are two people who universally had a message of positivity and, political relevance that dramatically changed the landscape in America. And I think bands like the Wu-Tang Clan took the landscape back into the gutter. I don't find it musically challenging. I know you recently had The Chronic on, and there was a bit of a debate about the merits of that. And I think the only merits of The Chronic are that it's beautifully produced. I think Dre's production in that's sensational. Mm-hmm. You could strip out all the singing is irrelevant. And I listened to the Wu-Tang Clan album today, and I felt sick from the minute it started to the minute it finished. It grates on me. It's nowhere near as good a record as the first 4 Public Enemy albums. I'd hold the first couple of Run DMC albums as being better. And it's not that Killer and a few of the Ice-T albums are really great. But what I can't be doing with is the marketing of, and I don't find it comic book, I find it juvenile. Juvenile violence, juvenile misogyny. So I can't bring myself to like it. I can't bring myself to be inspired by it. I can't bring myself to feel anything other than generally contempt. I really dislike this record.
So the guys, just picking up on what you said there, so the guys who talk about being influenced by this are people like Nas, Notorious B.I.G., Jay-Z.
Yeah, none of them excite me.
So
they all fall into the same bracket.
Correct. So for you, they're going down the same alley then, yeah?
Yeah, I mean, I look at, so I take something like, I watched the documentary that was on about the creation of Beats a few months back, the Jimmy Iovine and Dr. Dre documentary, and I watched that and thought, Christ, you're a really interesting guy. You seem very reasonable. I'm going to go back and reassess whether or not my view of post-Public Enemy hip-hop is shit. So I buy a copy of The Chronic. I think this sounds great. And within 10 minutes, I'm going, I don't want to listen to this. I don't think, and music shouldn't necessarily set an example by which you should live by, because nothing that, Bowie or Hendrix lifestyle that they were adopting, you approach or recommending a certain section of behavior. And the punk movement was all about rebelling against the status quo. But all the great movements are ultimately, to some extent, spiritually progressive. And so much of successful hip hop seems to be spiritually regressive. It seems to be about belittling people, about violence, and it's so horrifically misogynistic. I just can't take to it. I think this is ground zero of that cesspit, and all the Notorious B.I.G. stuff that followed, the Nas stuff that follows, huge amounts of the LA scene that responded to it, Tupac, all of that. Just stick it in the bin. Really don't enjoy it. But you give me It Takes a Nation of Millions to Hold Us Back, and I will listen to it from now until the end of time gleefully. Show exactly the same. First 2 Run DMC albums, magnificent records. But they were saying something, they were doing something that was inspiring. I don't find Wu-Tang quite inspiring.
Okay, mate, thank you. We do get Public Enemy, I think, coming up the track a little bit, and 1 or 2 others as well. But thanks for that. John?
Well, how did you follow that?
You loved it, didn't you?
Well, I did.
Good.
What Ian said may not may, it will need me to look at this again, because I rarely get into lyrics. So if there is misogyny and all that kind of stuff going on here, and no reason to doubt that, that would make me revisit my view here. But musically, I love this album. So I just play stuff in the background, right? And I've done for years. There's certain songs, the lyrics hit me. This hasn't, because I listen to stuff and it's not it's the music for me. It's not a primary thing about the lyrics. And I was looking at on Spotify, and we've talked about this in other albums. It becomes really, really apparent. You've got that E on Spotify explicit. Now there's only one song has that in this album, so I'm thinking, okay, that's not what I was expecting, right? So therefore, I kind of zoned out a little bit with the lyrics. So I'm going to need to revisit that. But
it's not just, actually, very quickly, it's not just a lyrical point for me, though. It's a lifestyle point that when you see them and they presented themselves, they were ground zero for that bitches and hoes attitude about rap music.
Right. Okay.
With me, I can't think of a thing that Chuck D ever did or said that would make me ashamed of him. I can't think of a thing that Snoop Dogg's ever done that would make me proud of him.
Well, I've said on this podcast quite often, Public Enemy are the #1 hip hop band in my life. Always have been, always will be. So they need a place in this top 100. I don't know the band overly well, but I do like this. Well, at the moment I do. I may need to revisit that. So, but I really enjoyed it. Musically, as I say, I'll need to go and have a look back on that. I felt it's quite, again, some, the samples were quite interesting. Some of the stuff that was going on there, there's a mix of film and music, which you don't always get, which I quite liked. And so that's left me in a bit of state of flux after that. So,
okay.
Yeah.
Well,
so
we've had this.
I'm not sure that. Well, I tell you, I will vote it in based on what was coming into, but I will revisit it.
We will revisit it. And we've had a wee bit like jazz. We've had a bit of a love-hate discussion.
Yeah, sorry. One thing I will say as well, we also have had that discussion around the person versus the music.
We have.
Around, so that's I guess a bit of blind spot for me about what Ian's saying about what their views are and the persona, I guess, that I just don't know that.
Blind spots are personal, and the blind spots that I might have will be completely different to yours, because I could sit here from now until the end of time saying that I think Morrissey's Vauxhall and I is one of the greatest records ever made, and I don't care if he's a right-wing nut job. But I can tolerate and can decide to ignore Morrissey's right-wing nuttery as being the ramblings of a sad, lonely 60-year-old man who doesn't get enough action.
I don't think he looks for action.
I think he secretly wants it. But I was a Smiths fan growing up, so I'm able to forgive him what he's become to an extent and look at the music objectively. I was a Public Enemy fan when I first came in contact with them. I fell out of hip-hop, fell out of love with hip-hop because of this glamorization of, violence, because of the bitches and hoes and all this kind of chat. So when you put a record on and the first couple of words of it are bringing you back to that, what it does in me is make me glad. For me.
Yeah. And we've had that chat on podcast before, haven't we? I can't remember, was it NWA or something like that? No,
it was. Yep.
And I made the point that it's just a litany of abuse, and it just great. to the point. So that, as I say, this to me, this was different. When I looked at the songs, I thought there's only one here with expletives, and I think, you know, I'm saying, you know, God, I'm not sounding like some evangelical ministers. Oh, you can't swear and all that sort of stuff. But it was song after song after song after song, whereas this album doesn't have that, and that's, to me, that was the difference. But I don't know enough about the backstory of the band.
Yeah, and all the
But again, it's that divide about the songs versus the persona, the attitude, the people.
Yeah.
I'm strongly in the camp that the songs trump the person in all walks of life. If we're going to have an issue with people, then let's chuck out Bowie's entire catalogue, because clearly he was up to no good in the 60s and 70s. So I think you have to separate it. If separation from a forgiveness point of view, I can completely relate to, but is it about an acceptance point? And all I'm saying is, I'm not suggesting you shouldn't like the Tang Clan, because I'm sure they all love their mums, and I'm sure those that are married are probably very nice to their wives. But the whole movement around it just turns my stomach. In the same way as, you know, Death, they're never going to listen to it because I can't get past what it sounds like initially. The door is closed to me. In a way that Chuck D opened the door, these guys have slammed it shut and said, it's not for you.
So are you saying then the lyrics on this album are out of order, or is it more about the band's lifestyle?
Lyrically, what half the songs were about. What I'm saying is that the minute I turn on an album and the first 5 words of it are the N word, and then I've heard bitch 19 times in the next 2 songs, I'm like, I don't really, this doesn't speak to me. You know, I don't expect a guy growing up in Harlem in 2010 to connect to This Charming Man by the Smiths. So,
well, I think in that point,
I just can't get past it.
Yeah, I think to the point on that, and versus the previous podcast we talked about NWA, I think this is night and day of a difference. I think NWA, when that I've been listening to that album, I didn't hear that enough for it. I'm not saying I didn't hear it, but it was not a feature for me that was really pulling through. So no, I'm going to stick to my initial thoughts.
Right, don't listen to me.
I'm voting this in.
Well, that's why we're here, mate.
No, yeah, but it's a good chat.
Yeah, that's why we're here. And we genuinely have all recalibrated various thoughts and opinions after chatting about stuff, both voting things in and certainly voting things out that we probably would have done before. I was just going to ask, did the Kung Fu thing not sway you all? A bit of Bruce Lee referencing and stuff? Is that?
If I was a fan of Kung Fu, it might have done. And no disrespect to Bruce Lee, but I don't bar watching Monkey, if you remember Monkey.
Of course.
In the 1970s, that was as close as I got to watching any Kung Fu. Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Exactly.
Yeah, so I think that my summary of all of that is, for me, is exactly what you are saying. I'm uncomfortable with rap only because there's not a lot of humour in it, or hip hop. I like the stuff that's either humorous or is kind of socially challenging, or whatever you want to call that. And this, for me, doesn't really have either of those. I do think there is a big cultural disconnect, you know, between us and what those guys are going through in Harlem or wherever it might be. So I don't think we can fix that, can we? But we can only call it as we see it. I did the thing I laughed at was that when they did the album cover, I think there was 8 rappers, wasn't there, in the band? They did the album cover. There was only 6 of them on the cover because 2 of them were in jail. That's why they wore the hoods and stuff, so they couldn't tell who was there and whatever. So, which I guess tells you.
I think I do take issue with your point. There's no humour in hip hop.
No, and that's
well, Brian would say what he doesn't connect to is the hip hop that doesn't have humour.
That's correct.
I think there's huge humour in Public Enemy and DMC.
Yeah, absolutely.
There's no hip hop in Goldie Looking Chain, though.
We've had that chat as well.
I know we have, yeah.
So listen, everybody was a no. Everybody was a no on that. A couple of guys didn't know it, to be fair, but the ones who did were a no. And John, you're going to stick to your yes for a moment
Yeah, I'm sticking yes.
for posterity.
Yep.
Ian, you're a
I think it's it's a really good album. So yeah.
good
I
man.
shall listen again with more open ears.
Yeah, and I'm probably somewhere in the middle, to be honest. Ian, you're a no for sure, yeah.
I would say so. I think there's better hip hop albums than this by a distance.
Yeah, I'm probably neutral on it. I didn't dislike it, but again, would I put it in top 100 albums? No, certainly, I don't think I would. So probably more leaning
I
towards.
think that there are better hip hop albums, but they should be in here as well. But I think this is a decent album.
And they may well be, I guess. We pick up a couple other ones up the list as well, so as well as Public Enemy, but whether they are good enough or not, we'll find out, I think. Okay, we've got one to go, which is number 26 on the list, which is Patti Smith and Horses. Okay, from its first defiant line, quote, Jesus died for somebody's sins but not mine, the opening shot in a bold reinvention of Van Morrison's garage rock classic Gloria, Patti Smith's debut album was a declaration of mutiny, a statement of faith in the transfigurative powers of rock and roll. Horses made her the queen of punk, brackets her CBGB buddy Tom Verlaine of television co-wrote the Jim Morrison tribute Breakup, but Smith cared more for the poetry and rock. She sought the visions and passions that connected the likes of Richards with Rimbaud and found them with the intuitive assistance of a killer band and her friend Robert Mapplethorpe, who shot the cover portrait. The real thing, Smith said later, was to keep rock and roll in the hands of the people. So that's the last one for tonight. Patti Smith Horses, released 10th of November 1975. John, take us home, mate.
Yeah, I think this is definitely an album that's worth its place in the top 100. I don't think it's an easier listen. I would have to say that. I'd probably say something that's, maybe a little bit stupid, but I think you've got to be in the right mood to listen to this album. You can say that about any album, I guess, but I think so, more so with some albums than others, and I think this is an example of that. We're talking about Van Morrison earlier, and I'm not a fan of Van Morrison. Gloria start, is just fantastic. It just builds and it builds. Really, really good. Song to start with. There's a lot of spoken word going on here as well, and I think that's, if you've read a bit about Patti Smith and I have, there's a great book called The Downtown Pop Underground, which covers New York, Patti Smith features in this heavily, around, when she first comes to New York, she's sleeping on park benches, nowhere to, stay. She meets, you mentioned Robert Mapplethorpe, meets him, they hit it off, and obviously he takes a photograph, for the album cover. She's doing theatre off Broadway, and then meets, Sam Shepard, Lenny Kaye. It's like, let's go and play some music, to your poetry. And the Patti Smith band also pretty much came about by accident. And she's then playing the likes of CBGBs, getting a bit of interest, album deal with Arista, which came out with this, and then she went on to bigger things. But I think it's not an easy listen of an album, but I think we talked about, probably in the first album on Jimi Hendrix, about influences, and I think you look at this, and that 1975, 76, it's kind of year zero for punk rock, right? This is it's not an out and out punk rock album, but it's got the root. 5 months later, they were playing CBGBs. They're all in that scene. Tom Verlaine for television played with Patti Smith. You can see all the influences going on. Even before this, early 70s, she was playing with New York Dolls, supporting the New York Dolls. We talk about MC5, Iggy, New York Dolls being that sort of prototype punk bands before it happened, and then into England with the Clash and the Pistols and the Damned. They were all soundtracking this album. Mick Jones talks about it a lot. So I it's just a really, really good album. And I think you look at her poetry, which was a real thing to start off with, and in theatre and all that kind of stuff. There's a lot of that in this album, and I think it's really quite interesting. There's a lot going on, and I think, and also the good thing about an album like this is you can listen to it, play it again a week later or a day later, you'll pick up different things. And if you can do that with an album, to me, that gives you, it just gives an album just an added element, really. So, yeah, I think it's fantastic, but not an easy listen. You've got to be in the right mood for it, for me.
Okay. So it was a debut studio album. It was produced by John Cale, and then there's the stories,
Right.
of course, that they didn't get on, which I guess may or may not have helped with the making of the record, because it does sound quite a sort of fractious record generally, doesn't it? Which that we can come back to. There's the Jimi Hendrix connections, because I think her first single was "Hey Joe," wasn't it? Before she did the album, which then isn't on the album. So, yeah, okay, Ian, what's your take, mate?
It's a masterpiece, and I find it an incredibly easy listen. But it's just, there you go, that's the joy of it. I could put it on at any point of any day, and it just feels like a familiar friend. To me, yeah, it is the kind of ground zero to some extent of punk, but it also feels to me to be a continuance of what was happening underground in lots of places. To me, it's always sounded like probably this being the most awkward they could be, but there's huge chunks of Leonard Cohen in there for me as well. And the number of albums nowadays, if you were to go and listen to The Birthday Party, the entire Nick Cave catalogue, huge amounts of The Clash, huge chunks of Talking Heads, definitely that whole new wave movement, magazine, television, everything in there. Their band were doing. Sensational frontwoman, sensational songwriter, brilliant chooser of cover versions. I'd probably say that I maybe prefer Easter as an album, bizarrely. But that's probably a production thing, because that's Jimmy Iovine, and he's doing a really great job of keeping it all tight. And Cale probably was a fractious prick in 1975. I can't imagine it would be an easy job. But yeah, nothing about it feels anything other than really familiar. But it's right in the sweet spot of what I love in music. It's a great record. I think it's a better record than 25th, but it's a great record.
Okay, well, we're getting towards the top end, and she was kicking about for a while, obviously, wasn't she? So it was interesting that when this broke through, I don't know whether she did help to create the punk feel, or whether she was just in the right time or not. I don't really know. And we've said this quite a lot with some artists, haven't they? That were they lucky, or did they sort of create their own luck? And what's your thoughts on Smith?
I think she created her own work. I mean,
Right.
I think she moved in '67, right? I think Virginia or someplace like that. She moved to New York, and like a lot of bands, artists go to New York. Over here, they'll levitate to London, right? So 8 years before that, but she's in that off Broadway thing where it's the freaks, shall we say, of the world, and that's in that book. It's the people that are the underground people. They're doing stuff. They're artists. They're culturally aware. They're picking up on things. She worked with, like, say, Gerard Malanga, that was in with Warhol, right? But she wasn't into the Warhol thing, whereas Robert Mapplethorpe was to a point. But she's obviously got John Cale in there as well. But she railed a little bit against the Warhol thing. and she worked with a guy called Sam Shepard, right? And they produced a play called Cowboy Mouth,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm wondering if that's where
It is.
it is, right? Okay. And that play, which I'm going off on a tangent again, but that play, its premiere was in Edinburgh at the Traverse Theatre in 1971, right? And then a fortnight later, it was in New York or someplace like that. So, just wee snippets like that, I just think, are really, really interesting. But I think, she's hanging about playing with New York Dolls, and it was very much them television. Blondie as well. I can hear almost, bits of Blondie took ages to actually be successful. They were, losing members left, right, and centre of the band, and eventually, it took off. But I can hear influences that Patti Smith has given that Debbie Harry's picked up on. Because all in that scene, Ian mentioned Talking Heads, all these other bands that are around in that time. Really, it was a small set of people, but my God, what an influential bunch they were. They've all went either, played in bands, became journalists, whatever, and really influenced what then became punk.
Yeah. As a bit of a side issue, she almost joined Blue Oyster Cult as a singer.
Yeah, but she feared the Reaper. She couldn't. Big problem.
Touche, mate. Touche. Yeah, she had a relationship, didn't she, with one of the guys in that. Cool. Okay. Yeah, big fan of the record. It's a fantastic record. Seems to be a bit of a kind of crossroads junction, or whatever you want to call that, for so many jumping off points over the kind of years that follow that. And we talk about influence quite a lot on these records, and A, it's a really good record, but B, the influence of it, I think, is pretty significant, which I think the two together go for a lot. Guy, reading up people like Viv Albertine from, she said the record changed her life, literally. Michael Stipe said, quote, get this right, the album tore his limbs off and put them back in a different order, unquote. And he ended up, they recorded, I think, Ian, didn't they? Somewhere down the line. Patti Smith and
New Vincent Hi-Fi, she's backing vocals on
Body Letter.
The tracks. Yeah, that's it.
So a whole bunch of stuff. Big Smith's Morrissey Marr thing, which again we're all sort of fans of that. So you can see, all the things that connect there. So it was proper crossroads. I also like the fact that she played the last gig at CBGB's before it was shut in 2006, I think that was. So kind of nice way to get closure on that. And one of my favourite bands tells a great story about her, about the Waterboys. So he wrote her a letter or something like that saying, I'd love to come see you. They were playing the Rainbow in London, weren't they? So he wrote to her and she says, just come down, I'll get you in. So Mike's got him away down and got her in and got him in, and he wrote a song about it and all that kind of stuff. So there's kind of lots of things coming back to certainly to me here that makes me a fan of this. I have had a copy of the record, and I've also not had a copy for quite a while, so I had to go and dig out my CD when I was doing this and listen to it again, but I loved it. So it's sort of back on my love list for sure. The guys were yes. No, the only no was Chris Thompson. So we'll be having words with Chris about that. And Graham's still listening again, Ian, so we're fine with that, mate. We're fine. And one last question before we kind of sign it off, because that puts it in. I'm assuming all three of us are a yes for that.
I'm an absolute yes. Stick on.
Yeah, me too, mate. And it might, one of the things we do, Ian, is we are going to get a chance to recategorize all of these albums into a new 100. So I'd imagine, I remember speaking about Hunky Dory some time ago, which was like 80 or something like that, and we said, we just didn't agree with that. So I think there'll be things that will go up and down on the list as well as being on the list itself. So I think horses probably nudge up a little bit. I was going to ask you, just interestingly, we do this now and again, 75 wasn't it came out? So how do we look at the NME's top 3 albums of 75?
Yep.
Want to have a jump on that?
You want to tell you what I think they are?
Yeah, 75.
75 NME's top 3 albums.
Correct.
Jesus Christ.
So the kind of critics' choice stuff, you know. John, you're always good at this, mate.
Born to Run.
Great guess. It's in there. It's not in the top three. One artist has got two in the top three.
Bowie. Yes, no.
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 Bob Marley.
Bob Marley. Wow.
Yeah.
Frozen.
You back on?
Are you just waiting for that? What do you got?
Sorry,
Back
mate.
on, we're good.
Bob Marley's got two on there. He's got Marley Live.
Neil Young.
I think frozen a wee bit there. Bob Marley. So we get Marley Live.
Bob Marley's 1 and 2.
Yeah, 1 and 2. Yeah.
Never.
Marley Live and Natty Dread.
Yeah.
Sorry, number 1 was Blood in the Tracks. So.
Yeah, well, if I had time to think of it, I'd have had Blood in the Tracks in there. But I was thinking NME would have had British albums.
Yeah.
And I couldn't think of anything significant from 75.
They were culturally quite ahead of their time, were they? They, you know, just didn't get to punk before it was all British stuff with John Peel and all that. Cool. And the other thing was, I read the book a long time ago, the Just Kids book. Somebody got me for a Christmas present or something like that, which again, I sort of remembered that I really enjoyed at the time. So if anybody's not read that, it's worth reading. And also genuinely didn't know this, that her son married Meg White from the White Stripes. Is that a thing? Did everybody know that?
I was aware of that. Yeah, sorry. I can't tell whether your dramatic pauses or freezes or not, Brian. So I'm not sure whether the screen's going or you're just dramatically pausing.
No, I think it's a bit of both, mate. Okay, so we'll try and cut to the chase then. So that's us done all 5. So we've got Hendrix in, Beatles in, D'Angelo in, Wu-Tang Clan out, and Patti Smith in. Or sorry, D'Angelo out. Sorry, apologies. 3 out of the 5. I need to rework with that number. That's 48, I think, isn't it? Out of 75. Cool. I'll update that. So, okay, good fun with that. Thank you. Before we finish, all our guests get the chance to nominate an album for us to consider to add to the list. And Mr. Smith, it's your turn now. So, what are you nominating and why?
Okay, so I started this when I started the White Album by saying any lover of contemporary popular music should have the first 4 albums as the best ever as Beatles albums. I will now caveat that. The album should have 2 records, 1 and 2 in the world, for they are the first 2 albums ever to have been recorded by anyone, ever. And depending the mood you're in, you could take the Sunshine album or you could take the Rainy Night album, and I'm going to jump in the Sunshine album of Songs for Swingin' Lovers by Frank Sinatra as singly the greatest recorded work the world has ever seen. And I would say In the Wee Small Hours by Frank Sinatra is the second greatest recorded work the world has ever seen. Songs for Swingin' Lovers, you've got Sinatra goes in. So if you don't know your history of music, albums never existed before this. Albums were simply collections of EPs. You'd do 3 or 4 songs, you'd combine them in a 12-inch record and fire them out. And Sinatra said, no more. We are going. And he goes into a studio with Nelson Riddle at the peak of his powers with the best big band that's ever been assembled, and takes the Great American Songbook and delivers the best versions of the best songs from the greatest songbook in the world. I mean, Christ, you've got How About You, you've got I've Got You Under My Skin, you've got Pennies in Heaven, you get Making Whoopee, It Happened in Monterey. It's just an impeccable 14 tracks of brilliant songwriting, brilliant musicianship, brilliant composition, sensational performance, topped by sensational performance, topped by sensational performance. It's, without peer, the greatest thing ever recorded.
Wow. I'm so pleased you put that forward. Genuinely am. I actually have one of those 2 albums on my list that I'm going to be putting on, or was going to be putting on for consideration. So we'll add that into the list, and both of them are fantastic. If anyone hasn't heard them for whatever reason, go and listen to them because they're wonderful. Okay. Brilliant. Thank you very much. For the next podcast, we will be reviewing. Ian, I'll give you a free hit on these, mate. You will get the chance to have a vote anyway, but since you're on camera,
Yep.
okay. So next 5 are Carole King, Tapestry.
Miles Better Than 24, one of the best records ever made.
Thank you. Beatles, Sgt. Pepper's.
Miles Better Than 23, one of the best records ever made.
Velvet Underground and Nico.
The worst Velvet Underground album, but still absolutely sensational, and miles better than most of the albums after it.
Notorious B.I.G., Ready to Die.
Piece of shite. Get it to hell. Get it in the bin.
And
Finally,
to finish, Springsteen, Born to Run.
Oh, masterpiece. Springsteen's second best album, but still an absolute stormer.
This is best then, Ian.
Darkness, the Edge of Town.
Which we voted out.
What? You voted Darkness in the Edge of Town out?
It was on the list and I championed it, and we are a democratic podcast and I was voted out.
Jesus Christ.
Mate, heartbreaking.
Springsteen's best record.
I know. Well, maybe get back on. We've all got a chance to put albums back on, so maybe we'll get to that.
I think all of them. I mean, I think honestly, Carole King is the greatest album that a female's ever produced, in my opinion.
Love it. Yeah.
Should be top 10 in anyone's list. Every Velvet Underground album, masterpiece. Every one. I'm more of a fan of Loaded. I'd rather listen to the melodic pop songs of Lou Reed than the scratchy anger of him. But Christ Almighty, what an import.
Agreed.
And then the big fat guy.
Yeah. I'm not even on the next one, am I? Because I think I'm at the football match, so I'm gutted I'm missing the Velvet Underground and Nico album.
We're actually hoping there could be a first in the next one. We might have two guests on one episode.
Yeah.
So, which should be good fun. Apologies, I know the technology's been a wee bit flaky tonight, so I'm not sure where that sits, but thanks for persevering, guys. Really appreciate it. Ian, thanks again for your time, mate.
Pleasure. We'll see you both soon.
We will. John, as ever, thank you. And guys,
yeah, couple of things just to finish. The last song on the Patti Smith album is about Jimi Hendrix, so that's a good bookend. We started with Hendrix, you almost finished with Hendrix. And the book I was talking about, that's it here, guys. Okay. The
Downtown Pop Underground. Okay.
Yeah. I'll lay it. If you want it, I'll give you it next time.
Yeah, love that. Absolutely. And I'll stick it on Twitter as well when we get the album reviews out. Okay.
Are you there next Friday?
What's on?
Straven?
Yes, I am. Yeah, for the Bluebells and stuff, yeah.
Well, I'll bring it then if you want it.
Perfect. Guys, thank you very much for your time. Always a pleasure.
Pleasure.
And we'll catch you soon.
See you later.
Thanks, guys. Bye.
Bye.